Porque en realidad,
También
para mí no, me queda mañana.
por esta noche.
Pero ahí vamos, ahí vamos.
¿Cómo llegaron ustedes?
Yo llegué el 29.
Ajá, sí.
El 29, sí. Nos entregaron el pabellón el 29, así que vinimos a revisar y era cosa, era una cosa horrorosa. Creo que dijimos, y mañana abrimos, o sea,
No hay nada, todo hay que hacer.
pero por construir.
Las paredes se estaban aquí, así.
Paredes estaban, no había ningún mueble,
Y los peones.
y las pegatinas estas sí estaban, pero no habían salido los muebles, esa división de la parte técnica no estaba hecha, entonces se veían todos los cables. Bueno, no, yo creo que trabajaron toda la noche, es puro, porque al día siguiente vinimos y estaba así,
Todo listo.
todo listo. La gente con
Salir de casa sí, para país. No tengo ganas de llegar a casa. Hay que 2 semanas.
un contar de pizza.
No, no te dije nada.
Sí,
No,
torta, claro.
está
En
en
Canadá.
Quebec, la ciudad de Quebec.
Hoy que
¿Me conoces?
hace muchos años, no recuerdo que sí,
Es una ciudad bonita.
pero,
Bueno, en el momento sí, pero sí, ¿cómo nos sentamos? Tenemos 5 personas.
somos 5 en el piso, ah, 5 en el piso y puede ser que se tenemos un slide, 7, no somos 5 no. Así que mirá, vos, y te fuiste a París y de París para acá. No. Okay. Please don't use your cell phones. Put them in silence during the session. Thank you. Ready? Good morning and welcome to you all to this beautiful panel called Ancestral Knowledge and Climate Change, one of the most expected panels that we've had in COPs, last but not least. So during these panels, we're going to be addressing climate change in an holistic way because it has never been so significant as it is nowadays, as well as building capacity for engagement and bringing together diverse knowledge systems in order to design and implement climate policies and actions. Through generations of close interactions with the environment, indigenous people have safeguarded an estimated 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity in their territories, as well as stored at least 24% of the above ground carbon in the world's tropical forests. Their knowledge and practices is an example of how to respect nature and understand its cycles. Knowledge that the global community needs in order to scale up climate actions, ensure food security and conservation while avoiding land degradation and desertification. Indigenous people have also been a key actor when it comes to showing the human and social impact of climate change, such as migration, water security, cultural identity, livelihood security, health effects, among many others. Together, the global community has an opportunity to rearrange the way it interacts with nature and build resilience for all through collaborating with and learning from Indigenous people. So, in this panel, we aim to three basic topics: highlight the importance of meaningful incorporating indigenous knowledge into climate change research, adaptation, mitigation, and climate governance, discuss the IPCC achievements in the reports while mentioning future pathways and challenges, plus mention best practices in this field. So, thank you all the speakers for being here. I'm going to be introducing you one by one and going to be presenting from that way to this one. So first, we are going to welcome Kim Marion Sayisa. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the Northwestern University. Welcome. We're going to be welcoming as well Angela Bermudo. Angela is an indigenous woman from Philippines. She's the co-founder of Future Horizon and the founder of Common Future and Amanu. Francisca Cortés Solari, she's our next speaker. She's founder and president at Philanthropy Cortés Solari. Welcome, Francisca. Francois Gillenot, he's the vice rector of International Affairs, Sustainable Development, and Philanthropy at Laval University. Welcome. Mr. Jim Ski, the IPCC chair. Welcome, Mr. Ski. And Ricardo Lagos Weber, he's a lawyer and politician, current senator at the Chilean Parliament. Sorry. Welcome, Ricardo. So, Kim, you're the first one to be presenting, so the floor is yours.
So thank you so much for having me. I sort of am a last minute preparation, but I wanted to share a little bit about the work that we're doing with tribal nations in the United States to support the develop to support tribes in being able to ask and answer science questions that can help them strengthen sovereignty. So we have an initiative called Strong, Strengthening Resilience of Ojibwe Nations Across Generations. This is an initiative between Northwestern University, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, as well as their 10 member tribes. And we have, I want to share a little bit about how this started and why thinking about as a university how we work with Indigenous communities. I am not Indigenous, I am a settler scientist, so I don't speak on behalf of any tribes or Indigenous peoples. But we really wanted to try to think about as a university, how do we do environmental research differently so that we can think about the climate and environmental justice implications of research governance and how we as scientists shape some of the ways in which justice possibilities are created on the ground, right? We often think of scientists as objective in a sense, but the way that we ask and answer questions really does create certain value um, trajectories in how we study the environment. And we wanted to figure out how do we undo that and create more space. So we asked our partners, what are their key threats to resilience and climate change, um, or resilience to climate change, and they said erosion of sovereignty. This is the number one threat for our Ojibwe partners, and we asked them what would it take to strengthen sovereignty, and they talked about really needing data to support two-eyed seeing in the way that they govern uh, their lands, their treaty rights, and also, um, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Exert their sovereignty in their territories. So we have worked with them to set up a few things. One, we've started with data sovereignty protocols and agreements with tribes, which this is something that can be hard for universities to do, but it's imperative, I think, that making sure that the indigenous nations we work with own the data. We don't ask questions that they don't ask us to ask. We don't answer questions unless in the way we only answer them in the ways that we've co-designed with the communities, and we don't publish unless we've worked with the communities to make sure that we're publishing in a good way. This is not the way the academy is set up with incentives, but one thing I'll say that it's really so we're in the process. We're in an early phase with and we just are. We have 3 MOUs that we're signing right now. We did get the university to sign off on the tribes owning the data, which was a real victory. And one thing that we're finding is that each nation has such different questions and different priorities, and we're designing a flexible data cyber infrastructure network to collect the kinds of data that tribes can use to answer their climate questions. And these questions change over time, so our key role here is to help build the scientific capacity in tribes. And then the idea is that this um, we're using an indigenous knowledge framework that was passed down by elders to inform how we do science, how we work with communities, and how we interpret data. But the data that we're collecting are really to try to complement and think about what's the knowledge landscape that we could really build out to really understand how we can adapt to climate change. Things are changing so rapidly, and one of the things that we've learned from our partners is that the way that indigenous knowledge evolves over time is also changing because of the rapid climate change effects that we're seeing. And so there, as they start to think about managing rice or managing their lands for other relatives and stewarding other relatives, what does it look like to have a scientific ecosystem that can support indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing? So I think that this is what we're doing. I can tell you more about it, but I think I'll stop there because I was a last minute addition, so I'm not sure if I actually spoke to what you wanted me to.
Yes, thank you very much, Kim. And just to mention, you just gave the perfect floor for Angela's presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Dispo Luwid Kayu. My name is Angela Bermuda, as was said. I am an indigenous Kapampangan and Aita woman from the Philippines. I grew up in a good way, and I love that you actually referenced that because it is something that you'll hear time and time and again with indigenous communities. The good way means growing up with the land, connected to your land, and being on the land from which your ancestors are from, which has a very strong power, and I hope that it is something that we will cover during these discussions. Um, I also am privileged in the sense that we immigrated to the United States when I was about 12. And so part of the work that I do is really being a bridge and taking that privilege in order to speak for the rights and enable collaboration between Indigenous communities and the private sector, as well as other stakeholders. I have three organizations: Future Horizon, which is a impact community of leaders from all around the world, who are developing a different way of collaborating with one another. One of the things you probably have heard very often here at COP is whose responsibility is it anyway? And who's really going to move things forward. So Future Horizon very much focuses on the side of focusing on the private sector. And much of the ways that we develop collaboration really pulls from those indigenous ways of sharing wisdom, of collaborating, of acknowledging the knowledge systems that we have. And so we also actively work with different indigenous leaders and trying to develop ecosystems, not just within certain territories, but also across territories on a global scale. The next part of that is really working with Common Futures. So Common Futures is a think tank and a design lab that's focused on trying to create more diverse and a different way of basically thinking about how do we develop different research and working groups to develop actionable future visions. So much of, depending on like which talks you've been to, you probably heard a lot of the conversation is a bit depressing. Um, and a lot of what we're seeing sometimes can be actually barriers to innovation. So what we're trying to do is actually promote innovation by bringing together multidisciplinary and diverse stakeholders, often the stakeholders who are not even, or are sometimes just considered and not involved in the overall research and development process. And the final piece is perhaps the most important. Amanu is an Indigenous led storytelling project. We focus most on the regions and areas where there's a high potential for cultural loss. What's the value and importance of cultural loss when we're talking about climate change? A lot of these knowledge systems and a lot of this wisdom is actually what guides us to understand our identity and our connection to the land. And a lot of the indigenous science is actually, based off that. And so things such as a high growth in population, displacement from original lands, and high economic growth are just some of the factors that will clue in as to whether or not a culture is at risk at loss. And so once you start to have that loss, you start to lose a lot of this knowledge, a lot of this information that's like very, very valuable for us when we talk about actually, putting together these different sciences. And so that's kind of speaking of holistic approaches. That is the holistic way that I find myself pursuing the mission that I feel that I've been allowed to be in this particular lifetime to do, which is really to try to redesign the world to create a more meaningful and shared future for all.
Thank you very much, Angela. And you also gave the floor to Francisca's presentation, considering the value of bringing back the culture. So please, Francisca, go ahead. Adelante.
Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Como ha sido en todos los paneles, hemos querido de alguna manera mostrar el trabajo que estamos haciendo en la reserva. Tenemos 3 reservas en Chile, una en el norte, que trabaja con los pueblos y comunidades quechua, en la zona central y en la Patagonia. ¿No? Es ok. Ya. Una de las cosas importantes, llevamos casi 21 años, 21 años, casi 22 años trabajando en muchos desafíos en Chile. En la parte norte, nosotros, como les comenté, tenemos una reserva donde están estos pueblos originarios. Cuando llegamos ahí, nos dimos cuenta que teníamos que mirar el territorio y obviamente, ¿cuál fue la primera amenaza que nosotros vimos en el territorio? La primera amenaza que vimos era la pérdida, obviamente, del lenguaje de las comunidades y con eso también que los abuelos, que eran los ancestros, los que vienen, los abuelos que tenían el conocimiento, estaban perdiendo también, de alguna manera, estos abuelos ya más viejitos en el fondo, se nos estaban yendo y necesitábamos de alguna manera dejar plasmado su historia, sus oficios, y todo eso. Entonces, traje aquí conmigo estos libros que están acá, que creo que es súper interesante y los tengo acá. Son 14 libros de relatos andinos del desierto de Atacama, de los quechua y de los pueblos originarios de los Andes. Cuando hablamos del norte, igual toma toda la parte de Bolivia, Perú, una parte argentina, una parte chilena, por lo tanto, estamos hablando de todo un ecosistema que existe en esa parte del mundo, que creo que es fundamental. Porque lo que hicimos nosotros es salir a buscar con los abuelos, con los mismos cultores, con los mismos abuelos, y trabajar con ellos ciertos guías donde trabajamos desde los textiles, eh, hablamos de coloramiento, el toreo, la partera, el hilado, el tejido, el trabajo con el adobe, la alfarería, la metalurgia. Y ahí están estos 14 capítulos que fueron terminados en el año 2020, con un trabajo bien extenso de muchos años y obviamente destacar aquí que hay un trabajo súper importante de las mismas comunidades donde han ellos confiado en nosotros para poder entregarnos ese conocimiento y salvaguardar también la historia de nuestro país, de nuestro país. Y creo, a lo mejor tal vez estos libros en el fondo como que si miramos un poco, tal vez no han tenido mucho impacto porque están sentados en el territorio, eh, pero finalmente nosotros trabajamos por resguardar y con un patrimonio cultural de Chile que es inmaterial y que hoy en día varios de estos abuelos ya no están con nosotros, así que honrando también a los abuelos que están aquí en este lugar y que han entregado su conocimiento y con ello nos dejaron también este tremendo, tremendo legado. Pues por otro lado, quise ser muy simple en esta presentación y traer justamente el trabajo que habíamos hecho, porque la evidencia es lo que vale. Entonces traje estos 14 libros, pero también traigo conmigo unos libros que llevamos ya casi también desde 2 años y medio, casi 3 años, trabajando nuevamente con las comunidades, nuevamente con los abuelos también. Estos libros son 10 libros que tienen que ver con el eh, cambio climático y pueblos originarios. Creo que es un gran tema para la humanidad hoy en día. Creo que los pueblos originarios son los sobrevivientes, son ellos en el fondo los que tienen los conocimientos, eh, su cultura, y ellos han sobrevivido con la tierra y para la tierra. Somos nosotros los que hemos perdido la conexión con la tierra, por lo tanto, lo que hemos querido hacer como Filantropía Corte Solar y como Fundación Caserta y como reservas elementales, básicamente guardar el patrimonio inmaterial. Antes de venir a la COP28 hubo un tremendo esfuerzo de poder sacar y poder traer aquí un primer libro de 10 capítulos que vienen de cambio climático y pueblos originarios, que lo traigo conmigo y le voy a entregar a cada uno de ustedes en modo de reconocimiento del panel. No alcanzamos a poder traducirlo, solamente se pudo traducir una parte, pero se hizo un esfuerzo de todo el equipo, contando que los equipos, fotógrafos, los que editan, los que trabajan en audiovisual, los que trabajan en edición, todas las personas que han trabajado en este proyecto son las comunidades. Nosotros solamente somos un puente y creo que somos como la biblioteca que hemos resguardado eh, la memoria de la cultura. Y lo traigo porque espero, en el fondo, que esto no solamente quede en Chile. Cuando hablo del impacto, creo que esto puede salir al mundo y se puede de alguna manera replicar en el mundo, porque se nos están yendo los abuelos y nos estamos quedando sin la información. Y yo creo que todos sabemos eso. Perdimos la lengua, estamos perdiendo los oficios, estamos perdiendo la cultura. Entonces, lo más importante para nosotros fue, de alguna manera, poner y dejar en algo concreto eh, sus diferentes oficios. En este caso, les voy a mostrar el libro, se llama Puri, Espíritu del Agua, y dice Saberes Ancestrales y Cambio Climático, y este es el primero de 10 capítulos que vienen asociados a el cultivo, la semilla, cambio climático, el trabajo con las aguas, este que tiene que ver justamente con las aguas. em, También trajimos un video, entonces le voy a pasar cuando terminemos a todos los panelistas uno de estos los libros. No voy a leerlo por acá porque se me agota el tiempo. Y además también comentarles que traemos un video que también hicieron las comunidades, y se esforzaron mucho, 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 trabajaron día y noche, así que le mando un saludo a todo el equipo, a todo el equipo, a la Dani Díaz, a Karen Vera, a Carmelo, eh, mm, exact- a Marcela Iglesias también, Daniela, ya hablé de Daniela. Eh, bueno, todas a las personas que pudieron, que estuvieron participando, no solamente en esta edición, sino que ya llevamos como 5 o 6 años ya trabajando en rescatar lo inmaterial de nuestros pueblos originarios, que abarca también toda esa zona. Entonces, vamos con el video porque ahí vamos a evidenciar básicamente los libros van acompañados, son 10 libros y también son 10 cápsulas donde los mismos abuelos están relatando el contenido. Entonces vamos a echar a correr en el fondo el video porque básicamente es mucho más importante ellos que esté yo ahorita aquí.
Gracias por venir a visitarnos. Yo me llamo Janet Cruz Cruz. Nos encontramos en el sector Peñalosa. Sí. Bueno, yo Corte, hija de mi nombre es Erika Pérez Argüello. Pablo. Soy Chihuahua.
La cosmovisión occidental decía, pero esa piedra no tiene vida o ese cerro no tiene vida, ¿qué te hace? Entonces por eso lo explotamos. Entonces, esa conexión de considerar algo sagrado, que es netamente del plano espiritual, nos ayuda a tener esa reciprocidad y ese respeto con nuestro entorno.
Si yo quiero que ella me disfrutó, tengo que hablar con ella, tengo que convidarla, tengo que agradecerla, tengo que estar conectada con ella.
Hay que volver también un poco a lo ancestral, a los abuelos, ¿no? Ellos hablaban con los abuelos, ellos hablaban con las quebradas, hablaban con las montañas, hablaban con la tierra, la madre tierra. Ellos se conectaban. Y ellos nos enseñaban a nosotros a hacer eso. Hoy en día, como está el mundo, no nos tomamos mucha importancia. Entonces, por eso también es bueno hablarle a las nuevas generaciones de hacer esto, de conectarse, de creer, de sentir.
A las aves lo dicen en el canto, las aves avisan. Entonces uno ya sabe que, entonces uno mira, tiene que mirarlas a la atmósfera, a la luna, al sol, y al viento también avisa y todo.
Como el amor del árbol hacia los pajaritos que le entregan sus frutos, como el amor de la planta que florece para poder entregar el néctar a los insectos, como el amor del sol que te alumbra todos los días, o como el amor de la luna y de la estrella que en la noche te indican las estaciones o que te indican cómo viene todo.
Todos ellos creo que de alguna otra manera nos tratan de decir, de mostrarnos, ¿no es cierto?, de que algo está pasando.
Cuando uno se levanta en la mañana, la madrugada, uno lo primero que tiene que decir, gracias por haber abierto mis ojos y dame fuerza hoy día para seguir adelante. Es una palabra que uno se la guarda aquí en el corazón.
Si nosotros perdemos la cultura de la gratitud, del aire, de la reciprocidad, nuestra alma se enferma. La tierra es el útero materno, es el lugar donde tengo el abrigo, el cobijo, es el lugar del candor, el último lugar donde voy a reposar, donde voy a descansar. En la transformación del cambio climático, ¿de qué manera nosotros, qué podemos hacer de modo que nos podamos transformar de manera coherente con el cambio climático y transformémonos de manera sin seamos arrogantes con el
Y volver a escucharla, volver a sentir, volverla a pedir, ¿cierto? A nuestra madre quien devuelva esa reciprocidad que tanto amábamos antiguamente, que no nos dejara lo que estamos viviendo hoy día, esa sequedad, porque nos olvidamos quién era.
Muchas gracias, Francisca. Thank you very much for sharing this beautiful material. We give the floor to Francois Guillenot, back to Academy. Please, Francois.
Absolutely. Let's go back to what universities can do. First of all, I'd like to say that I am not a member of an indigenous community, nor am I an expert on these topics. I talk on behalf of my university. I also wish to acknowledge the fact that Université Laval sits on land that is located in a region where 5 different indigenous nations have lived on for centuries, well before the Europeans came to North America. I'd also like to underscore the presence of a few members of our native communities in Canada that are among us today, and one of which knows much better the program I'll talk about a bit later. So if you have questions, you can address them later to Marie-Philippe. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer these questions. Let me just give you a few bits of information about Canada's context. So if you look at the latest population census, the indigenous population is established at about 5%. It is distributed in the country in about over actually 600 recognized nation governments and communities in the country. So it's a very diverse community. It's difficult to talk about one indigenous community. There's a lot of diversity. Needless to say, the arrival of the Europeans in the 16th century significantly, sorry, disrupted the indigenous way of life. A little over 10 years ago, the government of Canada held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It published its report in 2015, and I believe this triggered a real paradigm shift in the way citizens of European descent and Indigenous people in Canada relate. I'll be happy to talk about it some more if there are questions afterwards. So in the reconciliations efforts, universities from across the countries have been quite active in trying to implement some new initiatives to promote reconciliations, even prior to the publication of the Commission's report. Unfortunately, Quebec universities have been a bit less active until recently. It's not entirely. We, for example, at Université Laval, we had special policy in several programs to reserve seats for indigenous people. But our really our serious efforts at including indigenous knowledge, indigenous people into our community started in 2017. When we hired an indigenous leader to accompany the organization in structuring our reconciliation activities. We established a strong participative governance, which started with a large community to foster reflection on reconciliation, and then we designated a team composed of members of indigenous nations to guide us into the process and lead the different projects we deployed. Every project that we deploy with through that team is designed and delivered in partnership with the indigenous communities. We were helped, and I have to underscore that largely by a very generous donation by the MasterCard Foundation in 2022, which helped us make things happen. And it is the most important donation in the history of the university. So we designed a action plan that is called In Action with Indigenous People. The strategy is designed by, with, and for Indigenous people. It aims at increasing the presence of Indigenous people on our campus, both as students, employees, and eventually faculty members. It also aims at creating a more welcoming environment for members of Indigenous communities. And finally, it seeks to incorporate traditional knowledge in our curriculum. Uh, there's a few initiatives I could talk about, but I'll keep to one, which is the Land Guardians. It is a very innovative program to which Marie-Philippe graduated last summer, is it? And she's now managing the program. She's coordinating the activities for the program. It is a program designed by, with, and for members of the indigenous communities. The program is based both on traditional ancestral knowledge and university level training. Uh, it's designed to train individuals with a holistic understanding of the environment, able to understand the intricacies of their territories. The program is based on a mixture of classic university courses as well as field work in various indigenous communities. While the university training is offered by faculty members, the traditional training is provided by elders and women in the communities. The program, I have to say, is part of a pan-Canadian initiatives, but I believe it's one of the first to actually. So it's a national network, which we're really proud of being part of. I'll stick to that, but I have other examples to give if there are questions. Thank you very much.
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. And one of the challenges of being the IPCC chair is you're supposed to be an expert in everything. So later today, I'm talking about just transition, resource efficiency. And I also have this challenge as well. So just to quote Socrates, or quite slightly misquote him, awareness of ignorance is the beginning of wisdom. So please treat my remarks in that respect. And I will be a little bit procedural about it. So just to say, the case is very much made. IPCC needs to take into account and incorporate indigenous knowledge, so we understand the importance of the topic. I think we would also acknowledge that probably the IPBES, the Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has probably made more progress than we have in IPCC. And so, I mean, I'm happy to shamelessly copy good practice and to carry it across. And I'm already in conversation with the newly elected chair of IPBES, David Abura. We're actually already having constructive conversations. So just to say, in terms of wider context, IPCC was designed in order to assess codified knowledge. And that is a challenge in terms of process for incorporating indigenous knowledge. But one thing to say is that it's often thought that IPCC can only assess peer-reviewed literature. That is not the case, actually. If there is no peer-reviewed literature available, we can access other forms of knowledge, including grey literature. So I just wanted to flag that we can indeed have a more flexible approach there. So in terms of taking this forward, I'd just like to flag up, three kind of ways in which we can proceed. I mean, first of all, IPCC doesn't do research. The research take place in the scientific community, but IPCC can play a role in nudging the scientific community to move in certain directions. And one thing, we get lots of approaches here from philanthropic organizations saying, how can we support IPCC? And one of the lines I think we've taken with them is that they could certainly support processes that turn indigenous knowledge and take knowledge from knowledge holders and incorporate it into forums through workshops, other kinds of activities that would be accessible to IPCC for assessment. So that's one way that we could proceed. Secondly, I think we need to pay attention to the selection of authors for IPCC reports, because unless we know where to look, we will not be able to access the knowledge. So incorporating authors who really are sensitive, and we've heard from people on this panel, I think you could fulfill that need. Now, the other thing that we can do is engagement with stakeholders representing Indigenous peoples before, during, and following the production of IPCC reports. And one of the things that we've done in this cycle is that each of the vice chairs of IPCC has been assigned to act as focal points for different communities and constituencies. And I'm pleased to see Ladislaus Changa, one of our vice chairs in the front row there, who is actually the focal point for younger people and younger scientists. And Ladislaus and I had a great session with younger people yesterday. And I'm pleased to say that also that Ramon Peaks Madruga from Cuba has been assigned as the focal point for looking at indigenous peoples and the engagement there. So we have a specific focal point and channel for doing this. And I'll give you an example of the kind of things we would do. I chaired Working Group 3 of IPCC in the last cycle, and we systematically engaged with two of the UNFCCC major constituencies, the environmental NGOs and the business and industry NGOs, when we were producing our reports. But we could extend that to other major constituencies within the UNFCCC. And I think it would be perfectly possible, for example, for Working Group 2 in particular, to engage in that way during the review process with the Indigenous peoples or organizations. And just to say, Ramon and I had a very useful session earlier in the COP with the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform to discuss with them the three items I've already mentioned. The question of how you get from Indigenous knowledge from something codified that IPCC can access, incorporation of authors, and direct engagement. So, I mean, we understand the issues. We have a lot of work to do, but I think the big challenge now is how we implement all our aspirations, which is also the case for governments in terms of climate change, of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Key. It's great to know that Ramon is the focal point for indigenous knowledge and communities, so that everyone knows how to address to this topic for the IPCC. So, Mr. Lagos, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you to all. Good morning. Well, first of all, I will start for saying that I will not be speaking on behalf of Chile's indigenous people at all. They speak by themselves very well. Yeah, so that's the first thing I would like to say. Secondly, in order to see where I come from, Chile is a country of 19 million inhabitants, about which more than 12.5% are indigenous people. We have 9 different indigenous people, 5 in the north, Garas, Quechuas, Atacameños, Diaguitas, and then in the south we have the Mapuches, which is the biggest share of indigenous people, the Cahuascar and the Yagans, and then the 9th indigenous people is the Rapa Nui in the Chilean Polynesia. Yeah, so that's where we came from. Secondly, since Chile was a Spanish colony, and up to, we said, today, we have a debt with our indigenous people. Things has changed, certainly in the last 25 or 30 years, but until rather recently, even indigenous people, in the way that they were treated in Chile, they sometimes even hide their surnames, they hide their origins. Now, in the last 2 census, there we have shown, because they declare themselves indigenous. That's why I can speak now that we have around more than 12% of the indigenous people recognized as such by themselves. In previous census, that was not the case because of discrimination. So there is a positive change, if you will, but still we have a debt on on different areas. Now, when we try to talk about how we approach indigenous knowledge concerning climate change, concerning anything, development, uh, leveling the playing field, playing the historic debt, we have to have another approach than the one that we had in the past. And I'm a legislator, by the way, I'm a politician. I also have passed laws on these regards in Chile. And in the last, I would say 30, 40 years, we have been trying to do that. Uh, but, but it's difficult to reconcile for part of Chilean society with the fact that our indigenous people have belief, have a way of doing things, have a hereditary, ancestral habits, and that we have to take into consideration at the time of defining our education policy, in terms of defining our labor laws, in terms of deciding how we deal with the land issue, which is still a question in Chile, return of land. Yeah, the state has been actively buying land and returning the land to the communities. Yes, to a great extent, but that has not been enough. I can give land, but if I don't give the resources to exploit the land, if I don't give the education to take advantage of that land, we don't get that far. So I would say that, and I cannot be sitting here without not addressing something very important. We have had very difficult times in the south of the country because it seems that the pace at which we have been dealing with the issue has not been fast enough, and they are more radical groups that are making their point, not justifying what they are doing, but they are making their point. There is violence in the south. Uh, Me as a legislator and the government of President Boric, in the last year and next 2 years of government, every single month we have to prove a temporary law in terms of reducing civil liberties in the south, emergency laws because of the violence in the south. So that's to give you an idea of the challenge that we pose. So when we talk about climate change, you have to be dealing with also with historical data. When we talk about development, you have to do it simultaneously with the historical data. And that has proven not to be an easy part. However, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we have been able to pass laws to give access to education. Uh, we have recognized the language. We have been recognizing ¿cómo se dice? Costumbres ancestrales, yeah, habits or customs. We have managed to do some important steps, but we have a lot to learn yet. And there is the misconceptions, and I have to say it in Chile, in some quarters of Chile society, some resistance to accept differences. I finalize here. We're in the midst of a constitutional process in Chile. There was we had a political crisis 2 years ago, 3 years ago, with a social revolt, very, very strong social revolt. We find a way to deal with it in terms of having a new constitution in Chile. We elected a constitutional assembly. They prepared a draft. The draft was presented to the Chilean people. There was a referendum, and the Chilean people rejected the referendum. And among other things, I'm not saying that's the only reason, one of the reasons that Chileans, not indigenous people, but the rest of the Chileans rejected, or they had question, was about having separate justice according to indigenous law. And I know that the media, and I'm a politician, the right wing distorted things. I know that they did it in extreme ways. But even though there was some resistance of having or recognizing when we have to do justice, we have to accept that they have some special laws, way of doing things, and we have to respect that. But well, in the Chilean case, there's some resistance. So that means that we still have a lot to do in terms of opening up our minds and accepting that we are different, and we have to accept the differences as long as we have some common values. And I don't see a single value in our indigenous people that really conflict with the way I see life. So still, there is a lot of, I would like to use the word, but I would use it, racism still in the Chilean society, whereby we cannot even recognize that people that was there before that we even reached the continent. Now we cannot accept the way that they do things, and the way they do things, they do no harm to no one. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. And I would like to give the floor to Marian so that you can tell us a little bit on. Would you like to ¿Quieres hablar, tener la palabra en este momento? Okay, let me give the floor to Francisca and then I will go back to you. Marian.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los panelistas. Comentar, les voy a hacer entrega del libro, del trabajo que venimos haciendo hace muchos, 6 años, 7 años con los pueblos originarios. Y comentar también de que en Chile hay mucho mestizaje. Yo vengo de descendientes europeos, pero tengo un 7% de sangre indígena. Y eso es lo que sucede en Chile. Entonces, creo que es importante entender que todos los chilenos tenemos sangre indígena. Yo personalmente, me siento tremendamente orgullosa y lo único que quería era tener sangre indígena. De hecho, mi bisabuela tenía casi un 100% de indígena, por lo tanto, también siento que tenemos que entrar a no una discusión, sino entender que estamos todos en esta nave espacial, no hay diferenciación, no queremos diferenciación, queremos unirnos, queremos que los pueblos originarios también den la oportunidad, que haya tal vez más confianza en entregar, y por eso quiero destacar también, porque el trabajo que nosotros hemos hecho ha sido un enorme trabajo con los pueblos originarios, también nos ha costado, pero ha sido súper preciso, y quiero hacerle entrega de este libro porque creo que aquí hay algo que es concreto. Gracias, Uri, el espíritu del agua. Y un detalle. No sé si saben que en Chile hablan de algunos de la cordillera de los Andes, no solamente de Chile, sino Ecuador, Perú, Guatemala, todo lo que tiene que ver con Sudamérica. Hay algunos abuelos, no hablo de todos porque no puedo hablar por todos, pero hay algunos abuelos que hablan de una profecía, y la profecía dice: cuando el águila del norte se junte con el cóndor del sur, la humanidad va a cambiar. Entonces, en honor a eso, quiero entregarte los libros del sur, del cóndor, de la nación del cóndor, para que te lleves tú al norte todos nuestros rezos. Gracias.
Yes. Okay, so I would like to give the floor to you. Marianne, did I get your name right? Yes. So that you can tell us a little bit of your experience. We know that, tell us a little bit, where are you from? What's your activity? Because we all know that the Canadian approach to Indigenous has been very outstanding. So we would like to know your view about it.
Hello?
No, no.
No, that's okay. So I'm just going to stand up. I don't, like my elder said, I don't like having my back turned to people when I speak. Okay, so Kwekasinu Manipenup Nitihe Kahun. Hi everyone, my name is Mary Phillips. So I'm an Innu from the Nutarquan community, but I prefer to say that I come from the Nuchimit, which means the inside of the land, my traditional territory. So, a little bit about me. I'm the youth representative of my province, so the Quebec and Labrador region, the Indigenous Youth Representative. I also manage and coordinate the program, the Land Guardian program at University Laval. I was a student during the first cohort, and I'm also involved within the National Guardian Network, which is the first network managed by indigenous people to get all the guardian across the country. So in our program, because I manage it with one of my friends, it was really important for us to the first thing to bring the people to the land, because so glad that you had a good life, but for us, our biggest scars is the land. Many people doesn't have access to it. So the first thing that we do is to reconnect people and heal this relationship. So the way that we do that is through ceremonies and um, and by getting elders to surround us. So if we don't feel safe, because it's a huge scars for us indigenous people, then we have elders to heal us. After that, we go on the land and we learn traditional practices, because as indigenous people we have so many traditional knowledge. Like I like to say in my native language, so in Waimun, we have 7 different words to speak about the wind, depending of the direction, depending of the temperature. Can you imagine just a world where your language is so technical, like you can see all of the tiny detail of the environment. So it's why as indigenous people, we are the expert of the land. So when we think and when we talk about solving climate change, for us, we know the answer. It comes from our traditional laws to respect the land. And I really like your video. Really, it gives me many idea for my program. We'll do that too. So we are really technical, and this is it's not we are not activists. When I come here, I'm not an activist. I'm just taking care of my sacred duty to take care of the land, like my grandfather and his grandfather and millennia of generation before me do. So I think that's thank you, University Laval, for doing it. Making us the space to recognize traditional knowledge into the system knowledge is really important, because it gives us a sense of responsibility that was taken away from us by taking our lands away. So, because I'm half indigenous and half non-indigenous, my dad is a Quebecois. And for me, the way I see it, since I come from 2 people, I think that my non-indigenous side, their scars is that they forgot that they are a part of the natural world. We are a part of the sacred circle, not above it, inside the sacred circle. So when I go to my other side, I see that we were taken away from that and we can be a part of it. So we give many space for the indigenous people to take care of the land, because we are the expert. This is healing for us. And if the other side let the indigenous people take care of the land, it's healing for them too. And maybe they could get inspired by all the wisdom that we have in our knowledge system. So I'm so glad that we're doing this by and for indigenous people within the university space. And we have many ideas of work that we make people do. So, for example, one of the things that was also removed from us was the toponymy of the places. So they changed all the places of the land, and we're trying one of the work that we do that we make our students do is to just go ask elders and ask them about the traditional name, because all the traditional name of the places, they have so many information about the geographical um, thing that it contains. So yeah, we have many good practices, and I'm really looking forward to hear about all of your new idea that I can incorporate into the program. So Chinashkimitten.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And I would like to pass on the microphone to the gentleman over there.
Aski Sumauru, which in Aymara means good morning, buenos dias. Well, thank you to all panelists, also to the sister from the north. I have one question for you. I'm from the director of the Indigenous Peoples Forum of Climate Change, Chile. And we start to deal in a very good way with scientific research. We have made trying, and finally tomorrow we have our first side event with the University of Cambridge. So we're very happy, and you're all invited to Indigenous Pavilion at 6 p.m. On the other hand, I would like to ask you all, how do you think, which are the two most important factors or elements to integrate the indigenous communities with the research team project? And well, by the way, I'm grateful for the fact you have shown the indigenous community by itself by the video. So thank you very much. Tomorrow we will do the same. We will not speak in behalf of the communities, but to give them the opportunity to speak themselves. And second, Mr. Lagos Weber, it is possible to regulate the relationship between research teams and indigenous peoples in the context of the scientific research in Chile by Suma, which in Aymara means thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hi, hello, fellow national. No, I think it is possible, but it seems it's being done. Before coming to this panel, I did some research of my own, but literature is, and then I found that in 3 or 4 universities in Chile, one of come to my mind is the Faculty of Math at the University of Chile. There's a couple of papers of how to integrate indigenous knowledge into and the students into the curricula, and see how the curricula for studying math at the university level, the way and the ethics and the values quote that are being shared by the university community, the community of the university, goes in tandem with the belief of the indigenous people. So there is an awareness about this issue. Now, I don't do research. I'm not an academic. Perhaps the professor here may have a better answer to that. We don't need a law in Chile for that. We just need that the universities do their own job. Yeah, the faculties open spaces for that. And I would say very welcome. Hopefully tomorrow, I'm leaving tomorrow morning, but I mean, what will be most interesting. It was Cambridge University, you said? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, good. Hopefully it's rewarding what will be discussed there. But I mean, I cannot add more than that, what I just said. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, just very briefly, obviously the universities are incredibly important, but so are the funding agencies that support research within universities. And I'm certainly aware because, I've been engaged in UK-Canadian collaboration on global environmental change issues. I'm sure the research councils in Canada can give the nudges and the pushing to make sure that the work is actually carried out in universities.
If I may, I was going to say it's. I certainly think it's doable, and we should do everything to reach that point. But it's a challenge. The codes are not the same. I mean, and Jim alluded to it earlier on. I mean, in academia, the code is peer-reviewed, written research. That's not I mean, most indigenous people have oral traditions. How do we establish a dialogue between these two ways of building knowledge? It can be done, but we need to challenge ourselves, starting with universities. I think we're trying to do it. We could do more, and it's challenging on a daily basis. We're not used to I was saying in another panel this week that universities are extremely conservative institutions. They don't move fast. We need to push ourselves to do things differently, and that's what we're trying to do right now. And it needs to be done at different levels. But I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Angela, I believe it's your turn.
So I just want to comment on that. Obviously, universities, government, those all have different roles. There are a lot of organizations right now that are forming to actually have collectives with regards to bringing together different indigenous groups, not just in certain territories, but all over the world. So I want to highlight a few. They're not here right now, so I'm just going to speak for them. There's a wonderful project called Project Peoples that's led by my dear friend, Chad Frischman. If the name sounds familiar, he was he's like the lead architect, if not one of the lead architects of Project Drawdown. So this is an endeavor to try to actually document the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous science that exists. And so I guess you would count that as the private sector, but a lot is also happening outside of those spaces to actually be able to leverage the strengths and skills of those who have been more exposed in those kind of environments and enabling indigenous people. So I would just want to highlight that these things are happening. Another thing to highlight as well is we're hearing a lot of this talk of like before, during, and after. But oftentimes, and thank you, Jim, for pointing that out, because that is important, but it's not happening right now. Even the before part, when you're still deciding as to how the program is going to run, there are Indigenous people not being brought in. And often I hear, and as an Indigenous founder, being in different boards, being in different groups, and having the majority of them not being Indigenous, you hear this commentary about how hard it is to work with Indigenous people, and that is, that is very much a bias that exists there, and it's an untrue bias. So if you involve them at the very start, you will run into, I mean, in the private sector, a lot of people are familiar with this. If you involve people at the start, you run into less issues in the middle where you have to redesign because you've realized that you have not designed for the target people. So just wanted to kind of point that out.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this panel and hearing what folks are saying. So I'm glad thank you. I just wanted to mention if, yeah, I wanted to also add a few things. One, I would say there are, like Angela was mentioning, jeez, I don't know what that was. A lot of there's a network called the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. You asked what are the factors, and I think Indigenous data sovereignty is really important. And there are protocols like the CARE principles, which can align well with the FAIR data principles. And I think really thinking about how to lead with Indigenous data sovereignty is really critical. The other thing I would say is I think that especially in the I'm in the United States, white scientists, settler scientists have a real responsibility and obligation to create spaces and educate other settler scientists on the importance of creating space for indigenous knowledge. That's our responsibility, not it shouldn't always fall on the backs of those people who've been already marginalized. So I think but being very humble and being willing to be vulnerable and make mistakes and own those is really critical to starting to be able to create some space for trust to be rebuilt. The last thing I'll say, and this comes from our Indigenous partners, so we work a lot with tribal colleges. I don't know what other countries have in terms of Indigenous academic institutions, but our partners have often said, why are you always trying to take our people out of our communities? You need to be sending your people here. They need to also learn. So it's not always about bringing it's about bringing people in, but it's also about exchange and really creating the space where we push our university students to understand other ways of knowing. So I just wanted to share that there's a lot of space, and I think a lot of it is about relationships, which we don't take the time to build, and we really need to slow down to build those relationships if we want to address a lot of these concerns. And I know climate change is urgent, but relationships are critical to addressing big challenges.
Thank you very much. Francisca, some final remarks? And
Eh,
farewell, Mr. Ski, who has to leave. Thank you very much, Mr. Ski.
Solamente me gustaría como destacar del material que hemos traído de nuestro país, que nos encantaría en el fondo que pudiera estar en la escuela, que pudiera estar con los docentes, que no solamente sí, les encantaría porque en realidad es un trabajo de los pueblos originarios. Nosotros solamente somos un instrumento donde hemos hecho lo mejor posible. Entonces, ese material está, acá hay un trabajo de muchos años. Dani Díaz vivió en las comunidades atacameñas, Licanantay. Esto tiene un tremendo equipo detrás. Entonces, cuando tenemos estas cosas que son tan concretas, sería un sueño en el fondo que no solamente llegara a la educación de nuestro país, sino que también esto pudiera trascender nuestro país, porque sabemos que finalmente igual cuando hablamos del origen de la tierra, los pueblos originarios tienen mucha conexión. Y lo otro es que siento, y es algo que a mí también personalmente también me ha pasado, es de que cuando hacemos esa diferenciación, alguien se queda afuera. Entonces, cuando decimos pueblos originarios, tuyo, entonces el tema es cómo sacamos esa diferenciación y cómo eh, bueno, es un valor de los occidentales, tal vez, o de los que vivimos en la ciudad, de cómo en el fondo nos acercamos, pero creo que también podemos tener la oportunidad de que no exista esa diferenciación, de que no nos pongan como si fuéramos realmente, porque en realidad, como les decía, yo también vengo de los pueblos originarios y todos venimos de los pueblos originarios, solamente que se nos olvidó, solamente es eso. Gracias.
So I believe that with these words, we are closing. Okay. So thank you very much for joining. Great speakers. Thank you, Kim, for coming. And thank you all. Thank you very much.